We're now going to talk about two-tier policing for the next half an hour or so in the excellent company of former Met Police Chief Superintendent Mike Neville. Welcome, Mike.
Welcome. You promoted me, Kevin. I was a detective chief inspector, but I'll take the raise in my pension.
It's not written down here, so I just sort of I took a stab in the dark and overdid it. But you should have been a superintendent. You should be a superintendent.
No,
should be a superintendent now, for God's sake. Well, first of all, you're a copper of some standing. You were a long-term police officer, a very successful senior police officer who rose up the ranks. You worked at Scotland Yard, top of the pile. I've spoken to other people like you, former coppers. I've spoken to current coppers. I have not spoken to a single copper in this country who doesn't say to me there is two-tier policing. But apparently, if you believe in two-tier policing, Mike, and I believe in two-tier policing, we're right-wing extremists. Before we get to that ludicrous slur, there is two-tier policing, isn't there?
Absolutely, there is two-tier policing, and you gave several examples of that. And if we think of how the police manage an anti-vax march or an anti-lockdown march versus how they deal with Black Lives Matter or Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion, those sort of marches, it's completely different. And of course, we see the speed of justice. So with the people involved in the Southport disorder, they're swiftly dealt with. And yet, if you beat up armed officers at Manchester Airport, it takes several months for anything to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
And so. Or if you're a Labour councillor who says that the people who have right-wing views should have their throats cut, that also takes several months. But the bizarre thing about this, Kevin, is that the left have forever been on about two-tier policing. So they're two-tier about two-tier policing because they would always bang on that, young black men are stopped more than white men. So they would go on about two-tier policing. What they would never do, of course, is justify that. They always say that the police have said they're 5 times, 6, 7 times more likely to stop young black men, but they would never release the crime figures, which show that the officers are simply responding to the crime problem. The police cannot help the fact, say, for example, that 2% of London young black men commit 60% of knife murders against often young black men. So the left have been banging on about two-tier policing for many years. But as soon as anybody else points it out, then, as you say, it's far-right extremism, and they're condemning just ordinary people who just don't fit in with the liberal left point of view. And it's an echo chamber. You can imagine the people at the Home Office. They all sit there, they'll talk about diversity, but all of them believe exactly the same thing. And this is why you get these ridiculous reports like this.
Yes, and let's analyse some of the examples of two-tier policing. In the summer, those riots that followed the horrendous murders in Southport, obviously most of the rioters were white and working class. The police were down on them like a ton of bricks, arguably in most cases justifiably, but they were spread through the justice system with almost indecent haste, arrested on a Tuesday, in jail by Friday. Other people waiting 2 years for their case to even come up at court. So there was definite special treatment there. Same across all of those cities and towns that suffered those riots. I remember one kid, 18-year-old kid, who stupidly unfolded a sort of St. George's cross flag outside a mosque. 18 years old, just started an apprentice, got 3 years. Not to mention the keyboard warriors, housewives sitting there writing silly things on Facebook, getting sent to jail. Absolutely over the top, disproportionate, lunatic two-tier justice, two-tier policing. Go to Leeds, the Harefield riots. Remember those? Ethnic riots. And the police pulled out for 5 hours and let the rioters get on with it. People going the next day, look at the scenes of destruction. Well, if the police had stayed there, perhaps the scenes of destruction would have been somewhat less. Also, remember Birmingham? while these riots were going on around the country, mostly white and working class, people angry about the migrant crisis, people suspecting, by the way, Mike, that the perpetrator of the Southport murderers might be linked to illegal immigration or migration and might be a terrorist. Two-tier Kia saying, absolutely not true, they're far-right thugs. Well, they weren't that far off the mark, but you got to Birmingham, the Muslim community rose up themselves, furious about all these white working class riots. So they have a riot in which one white guy was stabbed outside a pub. No coppers to be seen. They pulled out, and the next day, the senior officer of West Midlands Police made a speech about like having to work with our stakeholder partners in order to police this in the appropriate way. In other words, they actually admitted, they actually went on to telly to essentially say that because this was a riot by Muslims, we treated it in a very different way to what we would have treated a white working class riot. Two-tier policing, it's obvious. And yet, people at the heart of government, people who work at the Home Office, think that because we believe that, we're far-right extremists. How dare they?
Absolutely. And you only have to see what the Prime Minister did. So the Prime Minister came onto television and said that he hadn't said anything about the Southport evil killer because it would prejudice the trial. But before the people involved who were alleged to have been involved in the Southport disorder went to trial, he went on television and described them all as right-wing thugs. So he's prepared to prejudice one set of trials, but not another. And then the most extreme version of this, Kevin, I think, is the photograph that was released of the Southport. I'm not going to name it because he's an evil bastard, and he doesn't need to be. We don't need to name him. We just know he's an evil killer. But the way that the police pussyfooted around the CPS and released that ridiculous choir boy, the Welsh choir boy photograph.
Yeah.
And instead of the mugshot, everybody else who's ever charged, they have this awful mugshot where, it's a woman who's got no makeup on and looks a complete mess, or some bloke who's been dishevelled in the cells. And it's almost released to sort of ridicule them and show what they're like. But with him, it was quite different. So once again, we have these different decision making. And there was an excellent article today by Trevor Phillips in The Sun, the renowned black journalist. He's very Trevor, straight, very honest and straight about these things. And he's highlighted as colour played a part in how people have retreated from reporting things. So when they came out with this definition of Islamophobia, people started to panic and didn't report things to prevent because they were worried about what others would perceive them. We saw this at the Manchester Arena where the security guard didn't stop the killer because he was going to blow himself up because he thought it might be accused of racism. So we see the consequences of this fear that's been created. The left have created a fear of saying anything about, is there a problem in this particular ethnic minority or whatever else? And the results of this are people being murdered and blown up in Manchester, little girls being stabbed hundreds of times in Southport, and all these other crimes. And it is not only two-tier policing, it is two-tier criminal justice. Mm-hmm. And what I would say, though, to add to our woes, this isn't just here. It's in all over Western Europe. I was in Germany after the sex attacks on New Year's Eve, advising the police there. The authorities tried to cover that up. In Sweden, they've done the same. I mean, God help us, but let's hope President Trump takes us over and puts an end to this nonsense.
I wish. And if you remember, when quizzed about, when he was specifically asked about the problem, the scourge of two-tier policing right after the Southport riots, this is what the Prime Minister did. He literally said, what about the problem of two-tier policing? He went like this. He ended the interview, just went, that's not an issue, and walked off. It is an issue. It's a very, very serious issue, and the authorities are trying to pretend, they're gaslighting us by trying to pretend it's not a thing. It's a thing, and it's a scourge. It's a really sinister stain on our society at the moment. That the police are not colourblind, and they police different communities differently, different types of people differently. As you say, why on earth did they release a picture, I'll name him, what the hell, Axel Rudikabana, where after he was arrested normal process. You release a current picture, perhaps relatives will give you one, perhaps you take one in the cell, you release the picture. They released a picture of it as an angelic 12-year-old choir boy, and I'll tell you why, Mike, because they didn't want us to think too badly of him, because he's a young man of colour. Now, call me controversial, but I tend to think badly of young men of colour or young men of any persuasion who stab little girls to death in a Taylor Swift dance class. You know, the thinking behind that. Let's put out a nice picture of him. Let's put a nice picture of this guy. It beggars belief, doesn't it?
It does beg a belief, but what it does, what we've got at the moment, and we've got to hope here, because we can challenge these things now. 5-10 years ago, it would have been shut down straight away. I think the momentum is with us to challenge this sort of behaviour and say, why is this happening? Why are you allowing this to go on? Because they know on the back foot, you can see already that Cooper, the Home Secretary, has dismissed this report. Even they are politically savvy enough to know that this is a disaster. But what you have is, and I've said this before, these people are addicted to an ideology, a cult, a new religion of this left liberal leaning. And this cult believes that in multiculturalism, there's a hierarchy of victims, and at the bottom of the heap are white working class men, and then white working class women, I suppose.
Yeah.
And what happens is, if anybody challenges this, if anybody says, look, this hasn't worked out so well, let's look at crime rates committed by certain groups. If we look at Albanians or Somalis or whatever else. And then again, Trevor Phillips has done wonderful work being honest about this, and that's what we need, to be honest about it. But to these people, you are challenging not just a policy, you are challenging an absolute religious conviction that multiculturalism is wonderful, that if there is terrorism, it's far-right terrorism. They'll bang on about the far right. Yet since in the last 25 years, 94% of terrorist deaths in this country have been caused by Islamists. Yeah. So that it's incredible. How can they bang on about far right when they know what the real problem is? It's utter nonsense, Kevin.
I was just saying exactly that to Rod Liddle, that you know, they stick their head in the sand and they say, oh, we've got this, but yes, we have a Islamic terrorism problem. We have a massive far right terrorism problem as well. No, we don't. We have a massive Islamist terrorism problem. As you say, 94% of all deaths in this country due to terrorism were due to Islamic terrorism. The biggest threat from terrorism in this country is by Islamic extremists. End of. And yet this entire report sought to deflect away from that. You know, we seek also to say that, you know, that Southport killer is not a terrorist. I say a guy with an Al-Qaeda manual and enough rice in poison to kill thousands of people is probably a terrorist. It is no other country in the world goes out of their way to not call a terrorist. We are terrified in this country, for reasons of racism and Islamophobia, of calling terrorists terrorists, and it's got to stop. It's mad.
It is mad. And what we have as well, of course, the more they water down this definition of terrorism, or pretend that the massive threat is not, you know, it's not Islamism, is that people get reported to that prevent. A vicar gets reported because he says the Bible, reads out the Bible views on homosexuality, or a schoolboy gets reported for calling somebody else a silly name. And all these things deflect away from what they should be doing in their true mission. If you know, we know the facts, 94%, 94% of their time should be focused on Islamic terrorism. But it's not, because all these things, because we like to pretend that's not the real threat. And you hear senior ex-police officers like Neil Basu banging on about the far right as big a threat as Islamist terrorists, when the stats don't add up. But these people are not driven by facts or statistics. They're driven by religious zeal and believing in a cult of multiculturalism, and that's the problem we have.
Absolutely, Mike. Very strong words, well said.